Hi. Today I would like to analyze a game which was played at a very strong tournament at Bilbao in Spain. And the two players in this game were GM Vachier Lagrave, who is one of the strongest French players in the world, and Levon Aronian, the strongest player from Armenia and right now the number 3 in the world ranked list. So Vachier Lagrave was white and he started the game with c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6. This is called the English opening, but this specific kind of variation is sometimes referred to as a reversed Sicilian, because white played c4 and black played e5, and it's kind of the other way around when white plays e4 and black plays c5, which is called the normal Sicilian. So it kind of reminds us of the Sicilian, but it's also different because white obviously has one more tempo. g3, g6. So now we see it's more a close Sicilian because black didn't play d5. Bishop g7, castle, castle, d3, now h6. Like obviously doesn't want white to develop his bishop to g5, so plays h6. b4. White takes advantage of the fact that the pawn on e5 is unprotected, so you can play b4, and if black takes now on b4, white could take the pawn on e5 and would be a beneficial exchange for white. So black just plays d6, now the pawn on b4 is attacked, white plays rook b1, a6, a4, and now black just retreats with the knight, because it seems like white wants to play b5 anyway. So black just plays knight e7, and actually indeed b5 is the usual move here in this position, but Vachier Lagrave chooses to play a different plan, plays bishop a3, which is kind of unusual, but also nothing too strange here. And yeah, usually in these kind of positions, white obviously tries to play on the queen side and advances his pawns here and tries to gain space, while black either plays in the center, tries to push d5, or in some cases, we won't see it in this game, he removes the knight from f6 and then plays f5, maybe f4, and tries to maybe even develop a king's attack, an attack on the white king. In this case, it seems he rather wants to play in the center. Played c6, and now Vachier Lagrave tries to undermine the black pawn structure by playing c5. Now it's important to notice that black can't advance his pawn with d5 because the pawn on e5 would hang. So he just plays a normal move, plays rook e8, useful move, protecting a pawn on e5. And now white plays maybe a little bit surprisingly e4, which is kind of blocking the diagonal of the bishop here on g2. But on the other hand, white wants to play d4. Without that, black could play e4, which would be a case if he plays d4 right away. So this is his idea. He wants to play d4 and then gain a good space advantage. Aronian plays bishop g4, pinning the knight, also preventing white from playing d4. And Vachier Lagrave immediately unpins the knight by playing queen b3. And now Aronian kind of regroups his pieces by playing knight d7, which looks strange at the first moment because the pawn on d6 is hanging, but white cannot really, I mean, he can take it, but he doesn't gain anything by taking. So he takes d6 and now knight c8. White just wants to retake the pawn on d6, and if white protects pawn again with the bishop, then a takes b5, a takes b5, bishop e6, queen b2, and now c5. And next move, like we'll just retake here in d6 and has slightly better position. So knight d2, maybe he wants to place knight to c4, so knight c8. If knight c4 now, then bishop e6, it's not really a problem. I place queen c2, probably to prepare knight c4, and now bishop f8, and like putting pressure on his pawn on c5. He's now threatening to take on c5, so white has to react in some way, and he decides to release the pressure and take on d6. He could have also played knight d1, I think. Kind of looks better because white is keeping this strong pawn on c5, which is kind of dominating the knight on c8, and he would have played his knight to a better square, to e3, and I don't know, just for me it looks more natural to play it that way. Okay, c takes d6, because now like immediately gets his knight into play. Doesn't really look very good. Now knight b3. Now b5, good move. Now it's completely blocking the bishop on a3. It's completely without perspective at a3, which is why actually white should have played bishop c1 immediately to play the bishop to a better square, but instead he plays h3, which is kind of strange because the bishop on g4 wasn't doing that much anyway there. And on e6, that's a better square for a bishop. Anyway, so black want to play this, and white is just helping pretty much. Now rook fd1, e takes a4, knight takes a4. Now knight b5, taking the bishop on a3. It's the move, bishop b2. And I mentioned before that white always wants to play d4, and now it has become a threat again. For example, if black takes this pawn on b4, then white could push d4 and he would get really good compensation. So a really good decision here by Aronian to exchange his knight and take control of the square on d4. And he played c5 now in order to open the position, and as you can see, white won't be able to play d4. Actually, instead of c5, a5 was even stronger, but okay, it doesn't make that much of a difference. So b takes a5, queen takes a5, now knight is hanging rook a1, and here black is a little bit better. To c5, the position is still around equal. Rook bc1, rook b8, another good move. The idea of rook bc1 was to play rook c6 if black takes on b4, and now white has a really active rook on the 6th rank, and he also threatens to take on g6 here because the pawn on f7 is pinned. So rook b8, good move. Rook is kind of pointing at the queen, and Lagrave decides to play queen a2. He could have taken on c5 and sacrificing the exchange here, and it would have actually been a better move. And white has good compensation with the strong pawn on c5. To queen a2, black is better, because now there's a difference. C takes b4 is now possible, or is stronger than before. Rook c6, again threatening take on g6 and maybe also take on a6. But this is of course more important, which is why black plays king g7. And now white finally is able to play d4. But, well, not under such good circumstances. E takes, no, not e takes d4, first b3, and this is the difference. This is the difference between the position we saw before with the rook on a8, queen on b3. Now black can push b3 because it can take, knight takes d4 and queen is attacked and the rook is attacked. And white will lose material. So queen b1, and now black takes on d4. And importantly, white has to give up his strong bishop. So black doesn't have to fear anything on the long diagonal because the bishop is exchanged. Black is a pawn up, but the white pieces are suddenly really active, and this pin is maybe a little bit annoying to black, which is why he played queen a5, which looks like an absolutely normal move, but indeed it's a mistake. He should have just played king g8, which is a really, strange move to just move your king at this point. But white can't take advantage of the pin, and it's just useful to move the king and maybe also preparing bishop g7, and black is clearly better here. And queen a5, on the other hand, white could have achieved a draw. Rook takes d7, queen takes a4, but white misses his chance and played e5. He should have played rook cc7. And probably what both players missed is that after queen a2, rook takes f7 check, king g8. Well, white can exchange queens now, and black would just queen his pawn, so queen d3 is forced, b2. I mean, it looks devastating for white. Black is going to queen with check, but indeed white can play queen d7, black queens with check, but there's no way for him to defend. Well, he can defend this from being mated, but he can't. It will end in a perpetual check. Queen bb2. Now rook takes f8 check. Rook takes f8, loses because of queen h7. So king takes, queen d6 check, king g8, queen takes g6, king f8. There's no mate because the two queens cover the mate squares here, but well, black can also not escape the perpetual, so it's a draw. Pretty cool line. So e5, also with kind of an obvious threat to take on g6 because the pawn on f7 is pinned. Rook e7, rook d6, threatening to take on a6, but moreover threatening to take on g6. And kind of surprising to me here, I don't know what exactly, how much time the players had left. Aronian played queen a2, and this allowed indeed white to take on g6. b2 would have been the winning move in this position. Because now if white takes on g6, it's not enough, and he doesn't have the time, because black is still threatening to queen with check, and immediately the white attack would be over, and for example bishop e4, black can just take and queens, and it's completely winning. But after queen a2, things are completely different. And surprisingly, now white is even winning here. Which is really surprising me. Which is kind of surprising because, I don't know, it seems like black has some pieces to defend his position, but it's not enough. And the queen is just so far off on a2. So far off. Bishop d5, threatening mate. Rook g7 is forced. If bishop g7, then bishop e4, bishop takes e5, take, king g8, bishop d5, and white is just winning. So bishop rook g7, and now queen takes h6, rook h7, and now white could have won by playing, or could have obtained a winning position by playing queen g6 again. Oh wait, he played queen e6 instead. Let me delete this real quick. So now I'll get into what happens after queen g6. So again, white is threatening mate. For example, bishop g7, bishop e4. Black has to move the rook, obviously. Rook takes h3, king g2, and the rook is trapped. There's no place to go really. So only square left is h6, and now queen f5. Just threatening to take on h6 and mating on h7. King g8, for example, rook c8, rook takes c8, bishop d5 check, king h8, queen takes c8, and white is going to mate here. For example, king g6, queen g4, mate. Yeah. And another possibility in this position would be to play rook g7 again, then queen h5, rook h7, now queen g4. It's also important to always keep an eye on this square, for example bishop g7, rook c8, and if queen b1, king g2, bishop e7, then rook g6. Threatening mate here again, so black has to give his queen, but it doesn't really stop the white attack. White will continue with bishop e4, the position is just winning for him. Crazy lines. So that was possible. After queen e6, things are different. Black first gives the check. Maybe that's the main difference. So black can give this check and get somehow his queen back into the defense. And now white made another mistake. Play king g2. It's just such a subtle difference between king g2 and king h2. But king h2 would have been better, because now after rook g7, it could play rook c4 and queen h7, rook h4, which obviously would not have been possible with the king on g2, because then would be checked right now, and this position is actually equal again. Maybe I messed up here a little bit. Maybe, yeah, I think black should play b2 at this point. Yeah. And then white takes, and now he has to give the bishop, but it's still a perpetual check. Okay. So king g2, and now, well, this whole maneuver doesn't work, as I said. So white has to play something else. Rook c8. Rook takes, queen takes. And black can't really defend the bishop, because this square is also taken, but he can play rook g8, and it works out. Queen b7. If white takes on g8, then important, black gives a check first on e4, king h2, and now takes. And this position should be winning for black, but it still requires a lot of technique and precise play. Queen b7 is a good try, but so now white threatens to play bishop e4, mating. So queen h7, queen takes b3. White is down a whole rook, but he has these nice pawns here, these nice 4 pawns which are connected. So black has still needs to show some technique. Rook g5, queen e3, queen e7, now f4. Rook g7, and white decides to further push the pawns, but the endgame which will arise now is lost. But also after our moves, it should be winning here for black. It should be winning. 5. Queen g5, takes, g4. And Aronian shows great technique here in the endgame. Bishop g7, good move. White cannot play f6 because rook takes e5. So now all the white pawns are in white squares and they can be blocked. Bishop f6, king g3, a5. Yeah, that's the problem. Black still has his a pawn, and white has to give his bishop for the a pawn sooner or later, and then black is going to win. h4, rook g8, g5, and now the main point, king g7. Yeah, if white takes, the white pawns are just blocked by the king, and black has no difficulties to just push his a pawn and win the bishop for the pawn. It's just easily winning. And after king f4, rook h8 again, good technique to force the king to go to g8, and now rook b8. Now black just push the pawn here. G takes f6, king takes f6, e7, last try. If black takes, maybe white can play king g5 and try to come up with something, but Aronian just plays a4 and white resigned, because if he plays bishop c6, just a3, e8, queen, rook takes, bishop takes, and a2, and black will queen and win easily, obviously. So the game ended after a4 at this point. Yeah, great battle, great fighting chess. Off the opening, black was maybe a little bit better, but then it got really complicated, really complicated, and both players made mistakes. And I think it was just an awesome fighting game, going back and forth, and well, in the end, Aronian won, showed some really good technique in the end game, converted his advantage. Great game. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I see you next time.